All right, Team ET. Well, welcome to another week, and this week we're going to an area that we haven't spoken about up until now on the show, and we're going to be talking about the brain. And I have a wonderful guest in Ann Betz. Ann is sitting in Santa Fe, I believe, Ann, right? And it's for me, it's very early in the morning, but for you, it's late afternoon. So welcome to the ET Project, Ann. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. My biggest challenge in this conversation is to keep us on track because this is such a broad topic. And what we're going to be talking about in particular is a model around consciousness that Ann and her team have put together some years ago called the seven levels of effectiveness. And we're going to dive into that and look at how this relates to you as a leader, as well as what the connection with this model is to neuroscience, or how we can connect neuroscience to this model might be a better way of putting it. So, Ann, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. It's so fun how we get to connect across the world.
Yeah. We were just chatting about. So I'm sitting in Shanghai at the moment, and you've been a visitor to China over the years. But things have changed in the last couple of years with the pandemic, and our lives are all different. So it would be wonderful to catch up if you ever come back over.
I will, for sure. I will definitely if I come back.
So maybe as a lead-in, and what got you into this whole field? You're a coach for the last 20 odd years, I guess, and then you moved into neuroscience. What's the background there?
Oh, it's a great question. So, yeah, I've been a coach since 2001, and I've taught coaching at every level from beginning to advanced, worked for a coaching school, run my own advanced coaching school now with my partner. But the thing that I've always been really, really interested in, like since I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate, I have been fascinated by what I would call human development or human consciousness. Really, it's the answer to the question of why do some people go through life with a certain amount of ease? And I don't mean the ease of taking advantage of people. I mean, really living their lives in a way that other people around them just are naturally want to engage with them and in a healthy way. And why other people struggle so much. Is it just random? Is it just fate? Is it karma? Or is there a way that we could kind of understand this? And so that's my bigger project in life. I think since I was 17 years old and was studying philosophy and going, what is the being? What is being? Right? What is it? Who are we? So neuroscience really originally was something. So we have developed a model, as you mentioned, called the 7 levels of effectiveness. Very powerful model, but it was not grounded in science as we developed it. It was developed more intuitively and from our experience of working with people and from a lot of people who were writing on the subject. And I like to say, it's a great model, but we couldn't get arrested. So either people were like, yeah, that's great. Or they were like, yeah, you have fun with that nice little model. And I thought, no, I need a way to be able to meet the skepticism that actually, because our model says, honestly, the way to success, the road to success is through the heart, is through operating with integrity, operating from truth. It is not through manipulation. And I wanted to ground that scientifically. I wanted there to be no argument. I mean, I think one of the cooking show, he'll talk about, okay, this is a jalapeno smackdown. I wanted a neuroscience smackdown. Like, this is how it is. This is how we work. Because if I can give you the science behind it, maybe there's more motivation and less resistance to being able to do the hard work of becoming that person. That's a long answer.
No, but it's insightful because, one of the things that I find challenging as a coach myself is to use models that are evidence-based and that have some grounding, particularly in science. And I think the whole popularity of neuroscience over the last 20, 30 years has started to open up this field where there's a lot of, let's say, things spoken about that may not be real or may not be true. And as we learn more, we somehow debunk some of those things. And it's great that you've made that connection between your model and neuroscience.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got a million things to say, but one of the things I'll say is that what has happened to me is if somebody says to me, this is how it is, 20 years ago, I would have said, okay. And now I'm like, yeah, who says who? What's the research on that? Like, really? Like, the other thing that I'll tell you, so where coaching comes in is, so I started studying neuroscience about 12, 13 years ago. And by the way, what is interesting is it was not in the popular imagination 12 years ago.
Okay.
It was, it seems like it's been around forever, but it really wasn't. And if you look at the books published and the research of applying neuroscience to things like leadership, that really started maybe 15 years ago with a man called David Rock, another fellow Australian, founded something called the Neuro-Leadership Institute. And it has not really been a conversation in the popular imagination very long. So I went because I wanted to figure out my model. But what immediately happened as I was in neuroscience studies in graduate school, what I started seeing was this is an argument for coaching, and no one was looking at the classic things that we do in coaching and why they worked. And so there were a few of us at the time, man out of Case Western Reserve University named Richard Boyatzis is one of my colleagues, another woman named Amanda Blake, a few of us who were all saying, wait a minute, we're doing this thing. It seems to really work for human beings. Why? And so I'm really thrilled to have been kind of part of that wave, that very early wave of people taking classic coaching techniques and saying, can we map these to neuroscience? And that's been so I'm kind of known in the coaching world for doing that. And not everybody knows that it actually came out of originally a fascination with consciousness.
Yeah, it's incredible. You mentioned two people there that I also enjoy following and reading through. When you and I first met, I had a little bit of foot and mouth disease, and
not at all.
We referred to one of your books that actually came from Amanda, right? So
I was flattered. I was like, give me credit for Mandy's book, but I do need to set you straight because I didn't write that one. But no, she's very impressive. Richard's very impressive. There's one of his colleagues as well who does not as well known, but will be Richard. I don't know if he'll ever retire, but he is getting older. And so the other colleague to follow is a man named Anthony Jack. And Tony's doing really good research as well and is kind of Richard's heir in the,
really?
So he's
I haven't followed Anthony. I know Melvin Smith does some work with Richard as well. So I think we will touch on some of Richard's work later in our conversation with PEA and NEA discussion. But yeah, it's a fascinating world. And as you say, it's very new. And I know you have a statement that you like to use about qualifying and making sure that you have this in brackets, this is the current status as we know it.
Yeah, well, one of the things, in fact, I wrote a blog at one point around how do we even speak about neuroscience, tips for speaking about neuroscience. And I think this is true of any academic. You will hear this, but I'm always very careful in how I speak about it because we can't say absolutes. And in fact, what I say is, anybody who is telling you absolutes, for example, here's an absolute. The amygdala is the center of emotion in the brain. It's not. Yeah. It is implicated in emotion. It plays a role in emotion. It is not the center of your emotions in your brain. It doesn't take over. It's much more subtle than that. And most things in neuroscience are. And so I believe any of us in speaking about this, in order to be credible, we have to say, often is involved in, is implicated in. Studies seem to indicate, I'm very careful.
Yes.
And, you and I were talking beforehand. One of the things I think it's helpful for people to know is that neuroscience became the first center of neuroscience, and I think it was University of California, Irvine, was the very first center was 1964. Standalone center of neuroscience where you could go study that. At Harvard was 2 years later. So even Harvard in the United States didn't have a neuroscience, center until the late 60s. So we're looking at under 60 years that it has really been recognized as kind of a separate discipline. People were doing stuff before that, but as a field, I knew a woman, she was a coach, who was at the very first ever gathering of neuroscientists. She was a neuroscientist and a coach. She's dead now, but only in the last couple of years. So she was young enough to have been involved in that. So young field. And then what we often talk about is brain scanning studies. There's a lot of reasons why those are, there's some issues with that. But even then, we've only had the ability to do they call functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a brain scan. It's looking at blood flow in the brain. We've only had the ability to do that for about 25 years.
Yeah.
So it's all very young. It's, what's exciting about it is we sort of have a new way of looking at it. We're learning new things every day. It's a fascinating field if you like a lot of stimulation, because there'll always be something new.
There is, and there's a lot of old theories that are now being challenged and rewritten. And I know you follow Lisa Feldman Barrett,
Yeah.
and Lisa's has this theory of constructed emotion. We won't go into that because that could be a whole separate discussion. But
we could do a whole hour just on Lisa's theory.
Yeah.
And actually have been able to work with her on some things with the International Coach Federation over the years, and brought her in to speak there. But it's, some of the simplistic ways that we have spoken, and I think a lot, you will hear this a lot in the emotional intelligence community and with people who have less of a deep understanding about neuroscience. You'll hear some real neuro-myths, which to some degree are sort of okay. And to other degree, on the other hand, if we can start understanding things in a more subtle way, we actually get more accurate information and can work with it more effectively. So that's part of what I love in this field, is being sort of paying attention to what are the myths, what's the truth, and how does this help us as we're trying to develop as human beings?
Yeah. Well, with that basis, we better move into the model. Otherwise, we'll run out of time before we even start talking about it. So let's jump into the 7 levels. And maybe if you could unpack the model first before we make the connection.
Yeah, and maybe we can link in the show notes there. We have them on our website translated into, I don't know, 8 or 9 different languages, something like that.
Absolutely.
So this is a model. We call it the 7 levels of effectiveness because it's a easier word sometimes for people to get their head around than consciousness or anything like that. But truly, it's about how present am I? How aware am I? Am I bringing energy to life? Am I taking energy from life? And it was originally inspired by people who were doing work in the field of human consciousness, levels of consciousness, not sort of consciousness from the sake of like, are we, how awake are we? But it's really at what level are we bringing our being to life? It's a little woo-woo way of saying it. So what we have come up with is 7 is a fairly easy number to remember. So we have 7 that we work with. I like to say it's a model. It is not the only model. It's a way of looking at increasing ability to move through life with grace and ease. I will talk about what the levels are, but I want to say, like, one of my students only fairly recently said, well, what is your definition of effectiveness? And I thought, well, that's a fair question. I think I probably should be able to answer that because I have this model. So I said, so my definition of effectiveness is less effort, more results. And isn't that what every leader wants, Wayne? Like less effort, more results?
I would say I would like that, definitely. So, yeah, I think that's fairly safe ground.
Less effort, more results. So the model has 3 levels that we call below the line. And they are levels that are, you can get results, but it is going to be a tremendous amount of effort. And they may not be long-lasting results. And the whole model, we use words because words are easy to remember, but it is like an increase in light, an increase in energy, as we go from 1 to 7. Now, using words like light and energy, you can see why I wanted to ground this scientifically, because it's sort of like, what the heck is even that?
Yeah.
So let me tell you what they are, and then we could talk about what the scientific grounding is.
Mm.
So the 3 that we start with hopelessness, and then fear, and then frustration. The least energy being in hopelessness, slightly more in fear, slightly more in frustration. But these levels, which each have their own biochemical state, are going to mean that life is going to take much more effort for any sort of result. And the result that you get may be very short term.
Right.
So, you can act out of anger and frustration. Those are some of the energy that goes along with that 3rd level of frustration. And you can threaten people, and they'll do what you say. You threaten people enough with something that's important to them, they'll do what you say, but they won't keep doing it unless you keep saying it. It's like you can get anybody to do anything you want them to do with a gun to their head, for the most part, but they won't keep doing it when you take the gun away.
So
And
it's
in fact,
somewhat of a
there's going to
negative.
be.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
It's somewhat of a negative energy that you're dispelling or pushing out, right?
Absolutely. That's why you have to use more of it. And in fear, people can't, you can have an organization that operates from fear, but it's going to take a lot of effort, and you're going to spend a lot of effort around protecting yourself. And I have a joke, and it may not be that much of a joke, but you can tell the level of effectiveness of an organization by how thick their HR manual is. The thicker the manual, the lower the level of effectiveness. Now, that's a little counterintuitive, but tell me what you think of that?
Oh, I love it, because I'm just picturing my company, so I can't go there. But the more policies and the more governance that's in place, the more fingerprint machines to sign into,
totally.
sign out of work. Yeah.
Because it's what it's showing is how much fear there is and how little trust there is.
Yeah.
And so we go then, we go through the hopelessness. There's like very little energy there at all. Fear, a little more energy, but you're trying to protect yourself. And so, the hopelessness is you can't even see a positive future. You've kind of given up. Organizations do not survive who are in hopelessness. That's like the last thing that happens before they implode. Fear, there's a little more of that frenetic energy, and that's the definition of that is you want to protect yourself against loss, attack, disappointment. You're trying to protect. A little more energy there. Frustration, you're fighting and jockeying for position. And it's all about, who gets the bigger piece of the pie and who can get this. It's, that's what we call it, frustration. Yeah. But there's a lot more energy there. There's some, by the way, I would say, there's a huge percentage of organizations in the world that are operating from frustration. Thinking that's the only way, thinking that's kind of the way. So
could you add in the word politics into that? Would that fall into that category as well?
Most politics, almost all politics.
Okay.
Yeah. It's fighting. It's about fighting against other people. And it's not like fighting for something positive, which might be more in courage, but it's against. Everything is us and them.
Yeah.
And so there's always a foe. There's a right and a wrong. And it takes a lot of energy. And obviously, and you and I know this from being in this field, if I'm everybody, I'm losing potential, interesting, helpful perspectives. I'm losing, voices that maybe need to be heard. Everybody is demonized, and you can get people riled up from that, but it's, again, not sustainable. And what I will say is, there's a famous quote. Martin Luther King said it. It's not his, and I can't remember who said it, but it is, "The arc of human history is long, but I do believe it bends toward justice." And I'm even looking at some of the people who have lived in a very aggressive, controlling way. Harvey Weinstein, for example, comes to mind. All based on threats and control. Well, look what happened to him. It took a while. But that is someone who operated out of frustration, who ultimately paid the price. Right. And I take a very long view of these things, saying, people will say, well, this, what about this person? They act this way, which we might think about in this fighting way of frustration. And, when people say, look at someone who's had this success or that success, or in our country, look at Donald Trump. And I say, yeah, but, right now we're watching Donald Trump implode. Fingers crossed. I'm just going to go political for a moment. But I watch people like this who operate in very underhanded, devious ways that I would associate with the field of frustration. And I think, this is not sustainable. Something will happen. We sometimes have to have patience and fight against it. So should we talk about the above the line levels? I know we don't have endless time.
Let's do that. I was just going to ask you the question before you move into that. So in psychology, they talk about the dark triad, the toxic leadership. So I can imagine that this fits within this realm of negativity and this whole area you're talking about. Yeah.
I have a fascination and an expertise in narcissism and sociopathy and psychopathy as well. I teach a program in that. And I would say, and actually one of the ways we started doing that is I was researching what are the correlates with these below the line levels. And we know that the key wound of a narcissist, for example, is shame, which is the lowest level. It correlates with our level of hopelessness. And so, when people are, for whatever reason, sometimes it's genetically, sometimes it's early childhood trauma and abuse, but they are unable to operate in an above the line way. Much of the time you could label them narcissists, sociopaths, psychopaths, Machiavellianism, things like that. And that is certainly often the impact that they have. So yes.
Very good. Sure. And so, before you move above the line, do you want to connect the neuroscience to that, or are you going to come back to the neuroscience?
And they go together. And so what I would say is the fundamental thing we have found in our search for what is the neuroscience of this model, like, is there a way to validate this? Is this just some spiritual model that doesn't have anything? The main thing that we found is something that is really proposed by a psychiatrist and researcher named Dr. Dan Siegel. And his, I'm trying to remember it's going to come to me. He's got so many books. He's got a brand new one out now. He's really considered maybe one of the founders of the field that they call interpersonal neurobiology. Brilliant man, one of the great minds of our time. And he proposes a definition of integration, that integration is things that are differentiated, separate, and linked. And what we started finding in our work is that very simply, it's sort of like very simple and also endlessly complex, is that when you are in these below the line states, you are increasingly disintegrated. So the parts of your being are not able to either connect with each other or monitor and modify each other, restrict each other. So you may find someone, so for example, two hemispheres of the brain, they were not really right-brained or left-brained, as most people who have any understanding of neuroscience know. However, they process the world differently.
Sure.
And that can have huge implications for how we deal with people and the situations around us. And so if you have someone who is not as good at being integrated between their right and left brain, what ends up happening is situationally, one can be overactivated. So you may have someone, the left hemisphere is very good at looking at details, looking at what is useful and utilitarian, because it processes the details. Right hemisphere processes the big picture. If the left hemisphere gets overactivated, people just occur to you as whether they're useful or not. That is not a recipe for building really good collaborative relationships.
Right.
So that might be an example, but we wouldn't say that that person maybe, it could just be situationally. Another situation, it could be that the right hemisphere takes over. But what's happening is they're not connected enough that, they can lean into each other and kind of keep going in a forward, steady state. So the more we go above the line, what ends up happening is integration increases. We get more connection and we get more ability to, and again, in Dan Siegel's words, monitor and modify. By the way, right and left hemisphere is only one example of one area of integration. Yes. We need to be integrated between what our body is telling us and what our mind is what our brain is processing. That's another area. I need to be able to listen to the messages of my body, but also calm myself down. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that we need to be integrated. But fundamentally, the more below the line you are, the less integrated you are. The more above the line, the more integrated you are. And we've been looking into this for 10 years, and I've been looking at all the research I can find. And I would say 90% of what takes us to higher states is our level of integration.
So if I'm a leader, I'm just trying to think about this in a practical context now.
Yeah.
If I'm a leader and I know that members of my team operate below the line in certain circumstances, how would I address this? Like, what could I do as a leader to try and overcome this situation or help this person? Or
Right. Well, I mean, so there's of course, because as I said before, I'm always very careful how I speak about things. So my first answer to that is, well, it depends. And this is why we train coaches in neuroscience, so that if you're a leader and I'm your executive coach, we may look at for example, maybe you feel like sometimes you're operating below the line. Well, we're going to look at, what aspect of you is not as well integrated? What part of you is taking over when it should be, working more in harmony with other parts of you? Same is true for direct reports. What part of them might be dominating and other part of them might be underdeveloped? So, one way of looking at this is, are you as a leader in terms of your team helping them pay equal attention to the being and the doing? And we are, in most of the world, we reward the doing and we ignore the being. And what will really create solid teams, solid results, good customer relations, sort of everything you want, is paying attention to both of those aspects. So as a leader, that is one place that I will often point people is, are you attending to the being and doing of your team? And is there an area where they might need to grow? But, what can you do with your team? It's like, well, let's figure out what it is that's amiss.
Yes. Sure. Yeah. And as I was asking the question, I realized it's a very broad base that I was coming from. So I study systemic coaching. So in systemic coaching, we talk about systemic thinking, systemic being, and systemic doing, right? Or doing and being. So how do you define being? What do you mean by focus on the being?
Well, so how I think about it, maybe it's better to talk about how I think about it from a neuroscience perspective.
Sure.
So one key way that I think about it, and we were talking about Richard Boyatzis earlier, and this is a lot of his work, is that one of the things we're getting out of in neuroscience is this idea of location-specific behavior.
Right.
This part of your brain makes you do that, because more of what we've seen is, I like to say, the brain is a system of systems. It's a whole bunch of systems.
Yep.
And there are two systems in the brain, two networks in the brain that operate in opposition to each other. In other words, the more one is activated, the less the other is activated. One of them very much is activated when we're focused on task, when we're doing something, when we're thinking about something, or making goal-directed planning, keeps us very much in the present moment, actually gives us that wonderful flow state. And that's called the task positive network. And it's great, but it has its limitations. And one of its so we might think of this as doing and being. Right. So doing, I'm in the task positive network. I'm clicking things off. I'm short-term memory, all of that. We might think of the other one more as the being network. Its technical term is the default mode network. And Richard Boyatzis calls it the social network, because one of the things that network gives us is understanding other people. So if you can ever think about times when you've been very focused on a task and somebody wants to like disrupt you or connect, and you're kind of like, I don't know if you're like me. I have gotten in trouble with this. I will be so focused on task. I don't care about anybody. And I actually care a lot about people, just not in that moment.
Yes.
And so the being, I think, the other things this network does is helps us focus on meaning, helps us have real inspirational moments. It plays a role in intuition. It is not the only thing that plays a role in intuition, but it does. So it's kind of a softer focus. Yeah. It helps us with introspection. Who am I? What do I care about? Understanding other people's motivations. So we can think of this default mode network as the place where we understand others and ourselves and the bigger purpose of what we're doing. And so that might be one way to think about being. It's also the place that we get motivated. We don't get it motivates us to do the tasks. But if you don't tap into this default mode and you just want people to do the tasks, they will run out of steam. Right. Think of it as putting gas in the tank. But if you talk to your team about, here's this project, what's exciting to you about it? What do you want? What could you learn if you did this? What's the contribution you'd like to make, and how will that help you in your career? And how can we work best together as a team as we're doing this? You can even have a short conversation about that. You're going to have gassed up cars ready to go versus just like, okay, everybody, here's the task.
Right.
Does that make sense, Wayne, how I'm talking about that?
Absolutely. So it comes back to this whole social preferences mindset that we're learning more about, that we are more social animals and our default mode is to be socially connected. So yeah, I fully understand. So I cut you off multiple times now in talking about your model. So far,
I should probably finish the above the line. So basically, we have them in seven buckets, but you just think of it as as an increase in energy, and you come to a certain point where you come to this line, and the next level, there's 4 above and 3 below. The next level is courage. And that's when we're willing to take a stand against, previously held or disempowering beliefs and actions, and we're willing to try something. Then we go, and so that's great. you're ready to go, but it's not enough energy that it's totally easy yet. It's like the doorway. Then we go to this level of engagement. And in engagement, what's possible becomes more important than what's not possible. And, you're more willing to kind of live and let live, focus more on what this person can do than what they can't. It's kind of about assets and strengths.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really solid level. And when I do organizational consulting and training, that's where I want organizations to get to.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it is the sustainable level.
Right.
There's two more above, but let me tell you what they are, and I'll tell you why they're hard to impossible to reach, although you can in pockets, and I encourage that. So the next level is innovation.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to be there, now we talk a lot about innovation and people will be like, oh, like Google. And I'm like, I've known people who worked at Google. Not always felt that great to work there. So I am not talking about creating the next product. I'm talking about what does it really take to be in this profoundly creative space. Here's what it takes. You have to be willing to set aside your ego, which means you have to know what your ego is, where it gets involved, and be able to consciously park it. The reason why I don't see organizations reach innovation as much as they'd like to tell you they are is it would require personal work on everyone involved to be able to set their egos aside. That is a rare state. And generally, people get triggered and they want credit and they, don't want this other person to get ahead and they feel like there's a limit to success. And so in order to really be there, it takes some deep personal work. I have seen teams that operate in innovation. And I will tell you, if you've ever been on a team like that, there is just no greater heaven on earth. Because people say, that's a great idea. What about this? I just had a team meeting with my team and we can sometimes get there and everybody's like, yeah, okay, well, so tell me why that might not work. Oh, that's great. That's a great point. Okay. And we come up with these brilliant ideas and nobody cares whose idea it was.
So you're really operating in this zone of psychological safety and all these areas,
Absolutely. And you're very aware of being able to kind of link all the parts of your being, be very integrated, be able to understand, watch yourself. You develop a greater capacity to be an observer and go, oh, like today in my team, and I'm not saying we're always there and I'm not always there, but today we did have a really great meeting and I have an idea about something I think we should do in my business. And the conversation sort of went a different direction. And I'm like, you know what? That thing that's gotten resolved. I don't need to bring that idea up. Doesn't matter. We've moved past it and this is a better resolution. It wasn't my idea. I don't care. Right? It's more important that a good solution be found than that it be mine. Most people aren't capable of that.
Yeah.
And you want to get a team to innovation, help people do the personal work where they no longer, where they care more about the enterprise than they do about their own personal glory.
What I find really interesting about that level that you're talking about is I talk about 21st century leadership. And this is a level where I believe 21st century leaders need to be able to get to. And for sure, it's a struggle. As you said, you have to let go of ego. You have to really embrace this wholeness, empathetic approach. And it's a challenge.
And being able to be deeply empathetic, but also move things forward. And the research is pretty good on leaders that kind of do one or the other. Those are not your magical leaders. The leaders that can, I worked for a leader at one point, lovely man. He was a wonderful friend. But, whenever I would I worked in a nonprofit, an NGO, and every time I would have an innovative idea, he would say, oh, that's sort of interesting, but, I think we really need to check in with all the stakeholders. And by the time we checked in with all the stakeholders, it was way too late to do anything. There was no ability to sort of assess, what's the balance? What's the integration between being aware of people's opinions, but also being able to try something? And maybe not everybody's happy, and maybe that's okay some of the time.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by integration there.
Sure.
The final level is synchronicity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of it as a profoundly integrated level, someone who's able to be an amazing observer of themselves and what's going on. I do not know anyone on the planet who actually lives there. I think we can have moments where it really just feels magical. And I think that's great. But I think anybody who says to me, "Oh, this new leader and they live in synchronicity," I think you know, I don't know anybody. I really don't. I've looked at this a lot. I know some really good people, but anybody who actually came close to that would be the first person to tell you they're not there. And anybody who would tell you they're there is probably a narcissist.
Very, very interesting, right?
Well, because the self-awareness of saying, no, I react sometimes. And sometimes I don't, I don't let go of my ego. And by the way, each level includes every other level. So this isn't like that old 7 hats process where you look at things from 7 different perspectives. This is an increase in energy. So if I'm in synchronicity, I am including everything, including the below the line levels. So I'm including my ability to set aside ego, but even amping it up more and really operating from a profound sense of love and alignment. And I do see that when we can touch on that, that is when life just flows with very little effort. So it's aspirational. It's an aspirational level.
We need aspirations to focus towards. I was just thinking while you were talking there, I'm wondering how much, from a neuroscience point of view, we have what we talk about in mirror neurons, and I'm just wondering how much mirror neurons play a role in getting to this higher state within a team context.
Right. Well, I mean, so mirror neurons, for those who aren't familiar, are neurons that fire. So many of the neurons in our brain the technical term is multimodal. So it's not just like, it's like if I'm drinking from my cup, my neurons are firing, but yours are also firing as you watch me do an intentional action. Or if I even told you about drinking from my cup, you may get cup drinking neurons firing. If you're a piano player and you watch someone play the piano, you can get neural firing of the same neurons. It's fascinating. It's one of the ways we learn. So mirror neurons exist in many different areas, including emotional, where we're experiencing someone's emotions. It is one of the differentiators. You were talking about the dark triad, where probably the number one thing that you can point to with someone who's highly narcissistic, Machiavellian, psychopathic like that, is that their mirror neurons they have cognitive empathy, but not affective empathy, which really comes from feeling each other. So your question was, how do they operate? They operate all along. They're kind of neutral. So this is why if you've got someone, particularly a person who has some degree of positional power, someone come in a really bad mood or yell, the research says that if I yell at a direct report and others can hear, it will disrupt everybody for half the day.
Yeah.
Because they'll be tracking it in their brain as if they've been yelled at. If you've got someone who's very, very negative, they physiologically have an impact on the rest of the team. And if it's the leader, that is amplified. So this is why, I think if you've got someone who's highly toxic in an organization, to me, my analogy for that is it's like having spoiled meat in the soup. You can't make that soup better until you get rid of that person. And largely, if they are highly, highly toxic, they're probably not capable of being helped. And I hate to tell you that. It's kind of the bad news in all of this. But organizations that are tolerating highly toxic, narcissistic, psychopathic behavior, you can't train everybody else to feel good about it. And I will tell you my line. This is a line. I've used this before. So I say a lot of team building training is trying to make the carrots happy when there's toxic meat in the soup.
Wow, I'm going to have to
You just
use.
can't make the carrots happy enough.
Can I use
Sorry.
that? I'm talking with a new client at the moment. I might have to use that, Ann, if I can.
I can't make your carrots happy. You've got toxic meat in the soup. Get it out of there.
Beautiful.
So,
Beautiful.
and part of it is we are processing in it. And even if I'm not the target of, being devalued or being insulted or being left out of things, or many of the tactics that really toxic leaders can do, even if I'm not the target, I will still feel it from the folks around me. And then you'll get get a very dysfunctional system of people either colluding or, trying to do end runs around leadership, or underperforming, or presenteeism, or literally getting sick. And so I've just come to the belief that, move them on, move them out.
Very true. We tend not to, is the problem. And
we tend not to. We have a false perception that they are somehow financially beneficial to the organization. I want to say one other thing about mirror neurons in the positive, but I want to just give you one other resource for everyone. There's a Stanford business professor by the name of Jeffrey Pfeffer. He's Pheffer, and he has a wonderful book called Dying for a Paycheck. And in this book, he looks at the real cost of toxic organizations. And he makes a compelling argument for, you can't justify having a toxic organization, as much as you may think the pressure and the stress is actually getting you more. If you really look at the numbers, it will be getting you less.
Yeah.
So it's good stuff. It's good stuff.
Nice. Please.
So let me just say that, so mirror neurons, so I just sort of talking about is focusing on the negative, but also it's true in the positive. So that, when you do have a leader and a team that is self-reflective, that is vulnerable, that talks about, how they feel about things, all of this spreads. And years ago, and you're probably familiar with this, Wayne, there was an article called, I think it's a Harvard Business Review, called Leaders Shape the Weather. And you can shape a sunny day or a stormy day by who you are being, has a huge impact on the organization. And people will entrain with your emotional state. The larger percentage will, not everyone. There are people who are sort of, impervious to it, but for the most part, people will. And if you model vulnerability, authenticity, care and concern, people feel that as well and will model on that.
So I'm very conscious of the time, but one last question to the 7 levels. When I was looking at it myself, I was wondering, is there a transition or a crossover between level 3 or frustration and courage? Is there some in between stage that we need to go through to get to from frustration to courage?
There isn't actually. Right. It's sort of like it's either you are contributing to life or you are taking from it. And every movement to go above the line passes through courage. But, one of the things that I say to people, and I still work as an executive coach, and, if I even ask someone something like, tell me that, like, if they tell me the truth about how they're feeling about something, that's an act of courage. To even acknowledge it is an act of courage. To say, and I've had people say things to me like, I do not like the way that I keep yelling at my team, or I keep yelling at my children. I'm not okay with that. And that can sound like a very below the line thing, but the fact that they can acknowledge it shines the light of truth, and I think is a courageous act, and we can build from there. So awareness is huge.
They're expressing their frustration. about their current state, but looking from a courageous point of view and being able to talk about it in that moment. So yeah, I can see.
Not talking about it all at all, or saying, oh, it's fine, or the kids are just, they're terrible, or, you made me, my team is so, underperforming, I just have to yell at them, no, then you're probably in frustration. But when you have an awareness of this and can observe it, and the ability to be an observer is critical, because that is part of how you then integrate. You have to be able to first observe and be self-aware, and be aware of your tendencies, and be aware of your triggers and what tends to pull you to a more below the line state. That's how you get above the line. You have to be aware of where you are.
I'm just laughing to myself internally, because one of the things I've just read about is the predictive brain. Right? So our brain, and I predicted at the beginning that there was no way I was going to keep our conversation within the right time frame, and we're way over time with our conversation. So I need to bring it to a conclusion, unfortunately. And I would love to keep talking for hours, but. What's got you excited or interested at the moment? Like, are you working on anything new, or what are you doing at the moment?
I'm working a lot on this whole issue of organizations and systems, and if we can, part of why I get really fascinated by dysfunctional systems is that I think it can help us create more functional ones. And so we're doing a webinar this winter called "The Truth About Narcissism at Work." And really bringing in a lot of the research around why does it stay so entrenched, and what is the research on the real cost, as I was mentioning, and what are where should we be pointing ourselves in organizations so that we can, have healthier soup. And that's got me really excited, I think, because people spend so much of their lives. And there's that old saying, people don't leave organizations, they leave bosses. There is a way, way too much toxicity tolerated in organizations. And I'd like to bring more light there and give people some sort of directions forward to move out of that.
When is the webinar?
It's in February. It's on my website.
Oh, great. So that's a good segue. So where do people connect with you?
www.BEabove, BE, and then the word above, like be above the line, BEaboveleadership.com. And yeah, we've got a webinar coming up, and it's available to anyone in an organization. You don't need to be a coach at all. And then we also do training for coaches. So it's all on my website.
Yeah, you have a number of different programs, I see. I was looking into one of them this morning, so you may find me enlisted at some stage. So, and it's been a fantastic conversation. We've scratched the surface on so much that we could have gone deeper into. We may have to get back together again in a few months and talk more about different things. But it's been wonderful having you on the show on the ET project. Ann Betz, thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all the best with your continued research and study into this field. It's fascinating.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's been a really fun conversation.
All right, great. Thank you, Ed.
So what are you waiting for? Hit the subscribe button below and click on the bell icon so I can pop up in your feed occasionally with a great tip for your ultimate growth.